Sonic the Hedgehog, a necessity for gracious living.
There is no doubt that Sega's legendary mascot is amongst the most iconic gaming characters of all time, with the blue blur starring in some of the most memorable platformers of the early 90s. At one point in time, it felt like this hedgehog with attitude could do no wrong, featuring in classic after classic throughout the 16-bit era. But while all of this was certainly the case for everyone's favourite RetroGame, not everything was well for Sega's close relative of a moon rat. In today's special upload, we are not going to cover just one lost Sonic game, but three, all of which tie up nicely into one big, ugly, rocky development cycle that spans over 3 pieces of gaming hardware. So without further ado,
I am Lady Decade, and this is the story of the lost, cancelled Sonic the Hedgehog trilogy.
The rise of Sonic the Hedgehog and the Sega Megadrive, or Genesis as it's known in North America, is certainly a tale of one of the most prolific rises to prominence in all of gaming's lifetime. The first game in the series, programmed by Yuji Naka, would become the Megadrive system pack-in game in the West, which, paired with amazing marketing spearheaded by Sega of America, would lead our favourite blue RetroGame to becoming an icon. It started to become very clear very quickly that Sega had a bigger market stateside than over in Japan, so in 1991, the very same year the first Sonic game saw release, the Sega Technical Institute was founded, an American development division of Sega that would be based out of California. This ambitious division of the company would be led by Mark Kearney, an industry veteran who had a great deal of experience working for Atari prior, the very company who had dominated the gaming market in America in the past. Sega was looking to bring something different to the table for this division, the likes of which had never been done before, and that was moving some of their elite Japanese developers to the American offices to work side by side with a team of up-and-coming Western talent. It was thought that by doing this, that the Japanese could combine their experienced gaming knowledge with Western ideas that would further help Sega continue to conquer the Western market. Sadly for Sega, it did look like around this time that the first Sonic game may be the last, at least under Yuji Naka's leadership anyway. Shortly after the release of the first game, Naka would walk away from the company over a disagreement about wages, but former Atari employee Mark Kearney would visit Naka's apartment in Japan and asked him to join his team over in America to give him a fresh start and aid him with his earlier issues within the company. Naka accepted, as the idea of combining American and Japanese design philosophies together seemed like a tantalizing prospect, so along with fellow Sonic team developer Hirokazu Yasuhara, the pair would move stateside to begin work at the Institute. Fruit from this endeavour would be harvested the following year in 1992 with the release of Sonic the Hedgehog 2, a game that to most people is even more impressive than the original. While a huge part of the gaming public would perhaps consider this one of the greatest games of all time, the development cycle that helped deliver this classic would be far rockier than anyone would expect. You see, sticking American and Japanese developers working together in the same division had created, well, division. Workers from both countries reported a rift quickly arising between the two parties, which was put down to both the obvious language barrier and cultural differences between the staff members. After the project was completed, everything changed, including the departure of Mark Kearney, who would be replaced with another former Atari employee in the form of Roger Hector. While American and Japanese staff would continue to work at the Institute past this point, Westerners would work with Westerners, and the Japanese would work with the Japanese. This would mean that Yuji Naka and the company would work on Sonic 3 and Sonic & Knuckles, while the American team would instead develop Sonic Spinball. After the development of Sonic & Knuckles was completed, most Japanese staff, including Yuji Naka himself, would leave the United States and return to their homeland of Japan, with Naka shifting his attention to the development of Nights into Dreams for the Sega Saturn. While staff on the development floor from the two countries did not get on as well as hoped at the Sega Institute, reportedly higher up within the company, relationships had grown even more toxic. According to the, at the time, president of Sega of America, Tom Kalinske, Sega president Hayao Nakayama held a great deal of admiration for the American team, and Japanese executives really did not like that. In total contrast to this though, author of The Ultimate History of Video Games, Stephen L. Kent, would note in his book that Nakayama was known for bullying American executives, constantly reminding them that Japanese executives were better decision makers than them, with both sides pointing fingers at each other after the successful launch of the Sony PlayStation. So how does our unreleased Sonic 16 game fit into all of this, you may ask? Well, as mentioned earlier, Yuji Naka and co went back to Japan to work on Nights into Dreams. In fact, most of Sega of Japan's focus began to be put into developing games for the Sega Saturn, while Sega Institute staff over in the States, on the other hand, were primarily tasked with keeping Sega's 16-bit market alive. Examples include games like Comics Zone, which were designed by Peter Moravich, were coming out of the Institute as late as 1995. Speaking of Moravich, prior to creating the cult classic that is Comics Zone alongside John Duggan, he would also oversee developing the Sonic Spinball title, the pinball-themed game that was created by the Americans while the Japanese worked on Sonic 3 and Knuckles. But after work on Spinball had been completed, Moravich shifted his attention to another Sonic-related project, a game that is today simply known as Sonic 16. Footage of this project can today be seen online, depicting what could have been. The title, named Sonic 16 to reflect 16 megs, was different from any Sonic game that saw release, as while it looked like a 2D side-scroller, similarities with previous entries in the series pretty much end there. This includes the movement of Sonic himself, who could now move up and down as well as left and right, widening the vertical perspective of the game's playfield. More surprisingly, imagery of the concept depicts stealth elements, with Sonic himself being able to hide against walls to evade detection and even be able to peek around corners. A bit of a strange mechanic to include if you ask me, considering that the franchise would become synonymous with going fast.
What is this? Metal Gear Sonic? Or perhaps Metal Sonic Gear?
The slower-paced action included further new features, such as a move called the Ring Attack, where Sonic could grab rings from his life bar and launch them as projectiles at enemies, a buzzsaw maneuver to clear obstacles, and even the ability to grab and hold onto ledges like in a Prince of Persia game. But perhaps the most intriguing feature this game offered of all, though, was the concept's art direction and potential story direction. You see, rather than taking influence from the Sonic the Hedgehog that had been created at Sega of Japan prior, Sonic 16 on the other hand was said to be based around the art style seen in the Western-created Saturday morning cartoon show that featured the Blue Blur. The TV series takes place on the planet Mobius, a bizarre land which is densely populated by anthropomorphic animals, making this world a furry heaven. Speaking of furry heaven, the show is mostly based in the kingdom of Acorn within the city of Mobotropolis, an area that is home to Princess Sally Acorn, a chipmunk who is not only many perverts online's deepest fantasy love interest, but also Sonic the Hedgehog's love interest too, with her in the show leading a group of freedom fighters. Sonic and Tails, who are among the show's freedom fighters, all want to defeat the ruthless dictator Dr. Robotnik, a man who's managed to banish the kingdom's, well, king, and has captured many of the world's citizens and transformed them into robot slaves. As dark as some of this may sound, the show is overall very slapstick, with the heroic Sonic constantly obsessing over eating chili dogs or mocking Robotnik, referring to him as Robotnik. Very mature. As cringe as this show was at times, as we know, things could have been much worse. I mean, they would go on to make the games extremely story-focused, including cringe characters like Edgy the Hedgie or whoever this is supposed to be. But back in the 16-bit era, Sonic the Hedgehog was genuinely still cool because cringe-inducing, overly contrived stories and characters had not been added to the games. Because let's be honest, if you grew up with this era of Sonic, you won't be interested in bullcrap like this. No offense, of course, to those who do prefer this furry strangeness. Regardless of Sonic's future, Morovich wanted to make Sonic games more story-focused in the early 90s, and Sonic 16 was planned to be the most story-heavy Sonic game yet. And with it being linked to the television show, the demonstration video of the game would feature a level resembling Robotropolis, enemies that resemble SWAT bots, and even showcase an appearance from Sally Acorn herself at the very end. The video that is widely available on YouTube supplying evidence of this concept's existence would be presented to series creator Yuji Naka to try and have the project green-lit. Unsurprisingly, since we know that this game was never fully developed, Naka would obviously give this title the thumbs down. But looking at how far the gameplay is removed from what gamers would have expected from a Sonic title, this should come as no shock. While a bizarre alternative universe where a full Sega Megadrive game based on the original Western cartoon is an amazing and hilarious one, I guess this pitch wasn't the end for our chili dog munching hero. According to former Sega of America CEO Tom Kalinske, initially the argument was that we could get another year of life out of the Genesis before we had to introduce the Saturn. Japan disagreed with me on that, so as a kind of stopgap measure, the 32X came up. Sega of America Vice President Joe Miller states that the importance of the 32X was to leverage the existing Genesis to keep it from alienating Sega customers, who would otherwise be required to discard their Genesis systems entirely to play 32-bit games, and to control the cost of the new system in the form of an add-on. To put it simply, the 32X would be aimed at players who could not afford the more expensive Saturn, with the 32X project becoming known as Project Mars. To help assist the Genesis in remaining relevant, Project Mars would of course need its own killer games to help get consumers interested in the add-on. When it comes to creating games to help extend the life of the Sega's 16-bit hardware, the Sega Research Institute had the perfect setup in place to continue to try and fulfill this endeavour. The idea behind Sonic Mars was to take advantage of the 32X's extra horsepower to develop the first ever 3D polygonal Sonic game, bringing Sonic to a dimension in which he had never been seen before. While achieving such a feat had never been accomplished before, this was not completely new territory, as Yuji Naka and his Japanese team had experimented with such a concept during the development of Sonic 3 at the Institute. According to a Sonic 3 developer, Takashi Iizuka, the Japanese team dabbled with 3D computer graphics for the game but were unable to implement them simply due to the limited power of the Genesis, so the idea was scrapped. However, now the American team had the 32X in tow. Now they were playing with power, so would attempt to make a 3D Sonic game a reality once again. Sonic Mars' proposal was assembled on the 17th of May 1994 by then lead designer Michael Kosaka. Assisting him with this proposal were two gentlemen known as Don Goddard and Chris Sen, the latter who had started working in the games industry in 1992. The tall task to make the first fully 3D polygonal Sonic the Hedgehog game was officially on, with the goal in place of creating a game with three-dimensional locales and a range of characters from Sonic's existing world. Early on, as part of this endeavour, it would be decided that heavy influence would be taken from the Western Sonic the Hedgehog television series, an idea that was plucked straight from the Sonic Xtreme project we looked at a few weeks ago, which is why some people, including that of Chris Sen, view both games as part of one long development cycle. Speaking of the TV series, this would of course mean that Sonic Mars was set to include every deviant art nerd's deepest fantasy, Sally Acorn, who would be included amongst this game's story. In fact, it is said that Sally was even going to be playable.
I'm sure some of you would all like to play with Sally.
Further to all of this, Sonic Mars was set to feature further TV show characters such as Bunny Rabbit, an anthropomorphic rabbit who has been partially roboticized, who possesses mechanical body parts that provide her with superhuman strength. Or should I call that super bunny strength? But more hilariously, the game was set to receive some completely new characters too, such as Tiara Bubowski. And no, I am not making this up, and no, this is not just some bad Sonic fan art. This character was set to appear in an actual proper Sonic game. Tiara Bubowski was an anthropomorphic Manx cat created by Chris Sen. He intended for her to be a love interest for Sonic to add romantic tension to the story. Additionally, Antoine and a SWAT spot were planned to appear, the former being rescuable and the latter signalling the player was close to the boss. However, as development progressed, all of these characters would be later dropped, thank God, as developmental difficulties forced the team to focus solely on Sonic the Hedgehog. Like Sonic 16 before it, Sonic Mars would be presented to higher-ups in Sega, but fortunately for Michael Kosaka and his team, unlike its predecessor, the Mars game would be green-lit for development to continue towards a release. While it was Sega of America who gave the go-ahead for this game, what is of note is that when head of Sonic team Yuji Naka first saw this concept game, he would simply shake his head at it and say good luck.
Probably thought there wasn't enough Tiara Bubowski.
This negative response was generated by a combination of seeing the less than impressive material he was shown of what the Americans had achieved so far, paired with his very own first-hand experience on the difficulties involved in developing a Sonic game. From his perspective, all of this was looking far from positive. With the project being officially greenlit, trouble would soon spark very soon after, with Sonic Mars lead Michael Kosaka leaving Sega altogether after a series of issues between himself and Comics Zone developer Dean Lester. Chris Sen would be promoted and placed in the hot seat, with Goddard being quickly tasked with reworking the game's script. During this time frame, it is reported that any elements relating to the Sonic the Hedgehog television series would be dropped, leaving Sally Acorn sex doll owners made from human bones disappointed everywhere. In 2007, an early script of Sonic Mars was leaked by original creator Michael Kosaka, which stated, "While Sonic is away checking on a security alarm in a remote part of the Great Forest, his pals Sally, Bunny, Tails and Knuckles have discovered a strange message from within one of Robotnik's supercomputers. Dr. Robotnik is trying to take over a computer VR world, Micromobius, and the message is a plea for help from its peaceful inhabitants. Sonic returns to Knot Hole to discover that Robotnik has captured his friends and taken them into his VR world. Sonic attempts to save his friends and thwart Robotnik's plan to reformat Micromobius. If you know your Sega history or video game history in general for that matter, you will be more than familiar with what a commercial failure the Sega 32X would end up panning out to be. Keeping this in mind and how messy the development of Sonic Mars was, it does not take a genius to realise as to why Sonic Mars would be scrapped. However, it would not be scrapped completely at first, but instead redesigned and reworked for different hardware altogether. You see, Sega remains very interested in seeing the creation of a 3D Sonic the Hedgehog game, so the failure of the 32X would not make those at Sega Research Institute give up so easily. Instead, Sonic Mass development would be moved from the Sega 32X and over to the Sega Saturn, which would be reworked into a new game known as Sonic Xtreme. Upon being moved over to the Saturn, the game that was being produced by Mike Wallace would eventually be known by the name of Sonic Xtreme. In typical Sega fashion, rather than taking a simple cohesive approach with the development of this project, instead 2 separate teams were instructed to design 2 different engines simultaneously, with one of these teams being led by the STI's tech director Robert Morgan, which included programmer Chris Coffin on board. The engine that this team came up with would be created using the same tools that were used to create the gameplay found in Panzer Dragoon Zwei, with Coffin being tasked with creating 3D polygonal bosses for the game. Some of these bosses at a later date would be documented on the Sonic Xtreme Compendium website and would include an enemy known as the Dark Pool Gorilla boss, a rock elemental opponent, and the Mecha Mite boss, an opponent with claw appendages and a powerful metal jaw. As for the second team, this one would be co-led by Chris Sen, who we mentioned earlier, and a programmer named Ofer Alon. These gentlemen would be tasked with building and editing the main levels for the game. According to Coffin, the reasons as to why the game would require 2 engines was so that the boss sections of the game could feature separate viewpoints from the rest of play. Some of the gameplay that was developed for Sonic Xtreme resembles the 3D platforming game known as Bug, and Mike Wallace would promise a Sonic game that would offer levels that would be free to roam and unconstrained by linear paths. A Mario 64 before Mario 64, if you will. The game would also feature an interesting fisheye camera system that would give players a wide angle to witness their field of play from. This interesting perspective would make the levels appear to move around Sonic, and the stages themselves rotating around with Sonic's fixed centre of gravity. This would allow Sonic to be able to run up the walls and arrive on what was previously a ceiling. The boss sections of the game, though, which we touched on earlier, featured a more arena style of play, with areas that included shading, transparency and lighting effects to showcase the Saturn's technical potential. The goal, of course, with Sonic Xtreme was for the teams to be able to bring Sonic the Hedgehog into the modern 3D era, whilst remaining faithful to the series' previously successful body of work. In 1996, Mike Wallace would highlight some of the direction they had for the game, stating, "We plan to have all of the familiar Sonic elements in the game as well as additional ones. We're giving Sonic new moves because Sonic is a hedgehog of the times. We're bringing him up to speed." To lean into series traditions, the game was being designed with many tube-like features being included, with our blue blur also being able to spin dash onto walls and execute other various familiar maneuvers. As the year progressed and work continued with the game at the Technical Institute, individuals from Sega of Japan would fly to America to check up on the Sonic Xtreme team's progress. This was, in fact, such a huge and important deal that even the Sega president himself, Nakayama, would be present on this trip. Amongst those analysing the game would be the company's executive vice president, Shoichiro Irimajiri, who reportedly was extremely, to excuse the pun, unimpressed with Sen and Alon's, extreme work. Sen would claim this was because the version he was showing off to them had been ported from a PC to the Sega Saturn by a third party who did not work at Sega, so the poor frame rate was due to their handling of the game. Sen and Alon would attempt to make amends for their mistake, but the Japanese visitors left the country before they had their opportunity. As for Chris Coffin's game engine that was created for the game's boss battle, Sega of Japan were very impressed with what the team had managed to come up with. However, they were still very concerned with the project overall and felt that a new engine would be needed to completely replace Sen and Alon's work. This would lead to Mike Wallace choosing to isolate Coffin's team, who would end up working between 16 and 20 hours a day to fix the Sonic Xtreme project. According to Wallace, Coffin actually left her apartment, cancelling her lease, going as far as to move all of her personal belongings into the office so that she could work day and night on the game in the hope of a Saturn release for December of 1996. As for Sen and Alon, following the Japanese visit, they would be dropped from the Xtreme team. However, they would continue working on their portion of the game in the hope that they could later pitch it to Sega as a separate PC game. Which makes a lot of sense really, considering the main issue concerned having their portion of the game running properly on Saturn hardware. By April of that year, a month after Nakayama and Co had left the USA, Sega of America Executive Vice President Bernie Stolar would head to the Institute to offer his assistance with regards to making Sonic Xtreme a reality, going as far as to ask the team as to what he could do himself to ensure that the game is successfully released by its December deadline. Mike Wallace would suggest to Stolar that in order for the project to run more smoothly, they needed to get another engine for the main gameplay very quickly. Wallace felt that Stolar should approach Sega of Japan and ask them to give him the tools and source code for Yuji Naka's Nights into Dreams, Sonic Team's 3D Saturn game engine. This would be the action that was set into motion to keep Sonic Xtreme alive. However, Yuji Naka was so upset by the events that had transpired that he threatened to leave Sega completely if the engine was to be continued to be used by the Americans. Chris Sen would later comment on this heated situation where he would state, "Personally, I can understand Naka's interest in keeping technology his team provided under tight control. Sonic was a franchise he clearly felt should have been handled solely by Sonic Team. He must have felt very strongly about it if he was willing to even threaten to quit." Moving through to May 1996, the game was available to play via a demo at E3, of course featuring Coffin's side of the work. By this point in time, tensions were running high at Sega's Technical Institute, with team morale driven into the floor, staff turnover high, and those who were left working for the subsidiary being extremely burnt out. Wallace would end up firing staff members for poor performance and even so-called disruptive behaviour in the workplace. To highlight just how grim and rundown everyone would become, Chris Coffin, who had had the most success with creating a functioning Sonic Xtreme, would contract severe pneumonia in August of that year. Mike Wallace would comment on this situation, praising Coffin as a human dynamo. However, he had to admit that she had worked herself into the ground trying to make this project work. Sen, working on his Sonic Xtreme PC game, would also fall very ill, being told at the time he only had 6 months left to live. But while ultimately surviving, it is no surprise really that the game itself would die. By early 1997, Sonic Xtreme had been cancelled, leaving Saturn owners without a 3D Sonic to call their own on the system. Instead, over Christmas of 1996, Sega of America were forced into using all of their marketing might to position Nights into Dreams, as gamers must have titled that year. The game that was led by Yuji Naka, the very same gentleman whose stubbornness would ensure that Sonic Xtreme never saw a release. What a sneaky, calculating As a compensatory measure due to a lack of Sonic on the Sega Saturn, this would be the reason that Sonic 3D would be ported to the system, a job that would be handled by Traveller's Tales, at least giving Saturn owners something Sonic related, I guess. Speaking of which, the man behind Comics Zone, Peter Morovich, would pick up some of the severed body parts from Sonic Xtreme's corpse. These assets would be reworked and used to create 3D bonus stages for the mostly isometric Sonic 3D game. Moving forward through time slowly, passionate gamers have been able to learn more and more about the cancelled Xtreme project, with a disc of a test engine of the game being sold at an auction to an anonymous collector back in 2005. The disc image from this game would be leaked out by 2007 for all to see and experience. In other more recent goings on, in January 2006, Chris Sen would open an online forum based on the game, revealing large amounts of information surrounding the game's development to the public. Further assets would be leaked online in 2007, including a Green Hill Zone ground model, a monitor model with a picture of Sonic and Amy on it from Sonic CD, and a Sonic and Metal Sonic model that was used in a boss battle. 2009 would see more stuff for the game leaked, including textures and levels from the game, along with 2 exclusive characters known as Chaz and Gabby. With regards to these 2 mysterious individuals, Chris Sen would shed more light on the matter, that they were used as test art in a personal side project of his that was using Sonic Xtreme's engine. More and more assets would trickle out over time from the game, but perhaps one of the most notable incidents that happened post the development of the original game was an effort known as Project S. This was a plan by Chris Sen to have Sonic Xtreme completed in an unofficial capacity. However, he would later adjust his proposed idea, stating he wanted to make a fan game heavily inspired by Xtreme. In January 2010 though, Project S would be cancelled. All in all, it cannot be argued that Sonic Xtreme does not offer one of the biggest what-if scenarios in all of video game history, as there is no doubt about it really that if a 3D Sonic game had seen a release on the Sega Saturn, then the console would have almost certainly have shifted more units in the West. Sonic the Hedgehog was just that freaking popular, and there is no doubt that a big Sega Saturn outing would have certainly turned some heads. What is most upsetting of all though is that Sega of America and the Technical Institute probably could have gotten away with it too, if it were not for that pesky meddling Yuji Naka. But ultimately, all we can do now really is speculate. So I am Lady Decade, and that was the story of Sonic Xtreme, the ultimate cancelled Sonic game. Finally, I would like to give additional thanks to those who back this channel over on Patreon, who through their generosity making content like this just that little bit sweeter.